Good evening and welcome to the 7th lecture of the 2025 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our 29th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is John Carlton and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyier Public Library for hosting us and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and for hosting them on their YouTube channel. And thanks to the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. Few artists have captured the heart and history of Frankfort quite like Paul Sawyier. As evidence of his impact, most of us in this room likely have originals or prints of his works hanging on our walls. Working at the turn of the 20th century, Sawyer's impressionist brushwork preserved the beauty of our beloved streams, hills, bridges, and historic streets and buildings. And he also captured the spirit of a community in transition, both in urban and rural environments. His landscapes and portraits record the light, life, and character of a Frankfort that had already begun to change, offering us both art and archive, memory, and meaning. Tonight's program will explore both Sawyier the man and Sawyier the artist, reminding us how Sawyer's work continues to shape our understanding of place, identity, and heritage more than a century after his time. And we're very lucky to have not one Paul Sawyier expert, but two Paul Sawyier experts with us tonight to share their knowledge and love of Paul Sawyier. And without further ado, please welcome Diane Dehoney to introduce our first speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, John. As he said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyier. On behalf of everyone here at the library, I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight. What a wonderful crowd. It is my great honor to first introduce William D. Don Coffey, who has spent 4 decades in governmental service. The first in federal defense work, the remainder in Kentucky Human Services budgeting, program evaluation, public health, and healthcare reform. From 1982 through 2000, his avocation was co-creator and co-director of some 35 folk dance schools, semi-annual week-long events featuring historical Anglo-American folk dances. With his wife, Sylvia, he established and for 15 years co-directed folk dancing in Frankfort as the capital city historical dancers and musicians. He created Legends of the Great Hall, a stately frolic and midwinter celebration of ancient music, dance traditions and delights, produced in 2005, 2006, and 2007 as a community fundraiser for Thornhill. A lifelong musician, Coffey founded and directed several choral groups, dance bands, and a couple of ad hoc orchestras, and has provided music for countless folk dances in several states. Over 15 years, he sang and played hammered dulcimer, guitar, accordion, and keyboard with the Mink Run Consort, a 4-person band featuring Celtic and Anglo-American traditional ballads and instrumentals. He composed a contemporary operetta, The Parables, and has authored 4 books. As playwright, he wrote 2 plays, Maisie's Dead, produced by Bluegrass Theater Guild, and Two Loves and a River, a biographical dramatization of Paul Sawyer's life, produced by the Capital City Museum. His presentation tonight is based on his 2010 book, published by Frankfort Heritage Press, titled Paul Sawyier, Kentucky Artist, an historical chronology of his life, art, friends, and times from Old Frankfort to the Catskills. Please help me to welcome to the podium tonight, Don Coffey.
When I first came to Frankfort in 1973, it wasn't long at all until I began hearing about this fellow, a local native son named Paul Sawyier, and they would always say, oh, he was a really good artist. And then invariably they would add, he was always drunk. He would give you $2 If you'd give him $2, he'd whip you out a painting so you could go buy a bottle. And then almost always they would add, oh yeah, he had a girlfriend. That's something about that didn't feel right to me. As I stayed in Frankfort longer and got to know people, I found Paul Sawyier paintings hanging just everywhere, in banks, in stores, in people's private homes. And they always seemed very proud to own Sawyier paintings and prints. I thought there's got to be more to the story than, oh yeah, he was a good artist, and he was always drunk, and he had a girlfriend. So when I retired, something moved me to go explore the true story and see what I could dig out and find out about the real man, Paul Sawyier. And Russ Hatter, sitting here smiling, helped me find a lot of my sources. And it was an interesting experience and a very rewarding experience to find out the true story of the well-known popular artist, our native son, Paul Sawyier. So I want to tell you the story, an abbreviated version that'll fit in about 45 or 50 minutes. His life story, which, as I see it, falls into 4 periods. His life period in total was 52 years, from 1865, the end of the Civil War, to 1917, when this country entered the Great War. The 4 periods of his life story are, the first one is childhood to age 18. The second is what I call the young artist, when he did his formal training. The third one is the mature artist, which is his productive years, 23 years or so, in which there's 3 phases of that third section, which I'll briefly spell out. And then there's the final 5 years when he moved to New York, especially New York upstate, and did, for the first time in his life, begin serious overdrinking. So that's the first correction to the story. Let's start with that first life period, childhood to age 18, 1865 to 1883. I call it the artist apparent. Paul Sawyier had very deep roots in Frankfort. His ancestors were people called the Wingates and the Andersons. They arrived here in the late 1700s. Their descendants, I think 2 generations down, included 2 sisters, Penelope and Parmelia Wingate. These 2 sisters would become Paul's 2 grandmothers. Their children, first cousins, Nathaniel Sawyier and Ellen Wingate, became Paul's parents. 5 of their 8 children survived to adulthood. Lillian, the eldest, was born in 1862, Henry in 1863, Paul in 65, Natalie in 69, and Mary Campbell in 1870. The 5 siblings spent their entire growing up here in Frankfort. When Paul was 5 years old, they were living at a family farm in central Ohio and moved to Frankfort, which at the time population about 5,400 people. They moved in, lived with Ellen's widowed mother in the family home that had been built by her grandfather on East Broadway, right where the front doors of the History Center are today. And at that time, that section of Broadway was considered a very select neighborhood. In 1871, Paul entered first grade at 2nd Street School, which had been newly opened just 3 years earlier. The school only went through the 10th grade, so Paul finished his last 2 years of high school at the Dudley Institute, an Episcopal school that sat on 2nd Street, where the City Hall stands today. His second life period, the young artist, His age is 19 to 24, lasting 6 years between 1884 and 89. Here's a few collected snippets about Paul as a young adult, as you see him sitting there. He was a short man, about 5'6" to 5'8", weighed about 160 pounds. He had gray eyes and a rather dark olive complexion. Paul had a personality. He was quiet and reserved. He was always gracious and charming. That reputation stayed with him his entire life. He joined the First Baptist Church, but he attended only occasionally. He loved nature. He especially loved fishing. He was skilled at art. He had no talent at all for marketing, and this was a great burden on his entire life and made his life much harder because he could not sell what he painted, at least not for any decent price. At age 19, Paul enrolled in art classes at the Cincinnati Art Academy. He commuted over to the academy from the Covington home of his mother's sister, Sarah McKee. He was at the Art Academy. He was introduced to en plein air, which is French for painting outside in the open air with natural light. He would often start out, as plein air artists do, by going outside, sketching whatever you see in the changing light, and then finish it later indoors. He learned about European artists like Monet and Renoir and their impressionist style, and he was carried away by it. He really liked Impressionism and would devote much of his artistic life to painting impressionist style. I'd say it dominated his painting through his most productive adult years. He started out with oils and was quite good at portraiture, but he left that behind. Never totally left oil portraits because they paid better than watercolors. But he liked watercolors, and so that's what he did the most of. In 1886, Paul's grandmother, Penelope Wingate, donated money to build a parsonage behind the First Baptist Church. And if you know where that alley is down there today, there's a building right there where the parsonage used to be. This generous act of his grandmother would be very significant for Paul just a few years later. Also that year, former students Paul Sawyier and Avery Sharp opened a portrait studio in downtown Cincinnati. The studio lasted about a year, and it ended when Paul's father sent a letter of ultimatum insisting that Paul return home and work for Dad's new hemp mill. In case you're not aware that the hemp mill used to be here, it was a big deal in its day. They took in hemp and turned it into rope and twine, and it sat where Jim's Seafood sat until just recently. Paul's new job with the mill was traveling salesman. He traveled by train through the Midwestern states, stayed on the road 2 to 4 weeks at a time, selling rope and twine. The payroll documents for Kentucky River Mills show that he worked for them off and on over the 6 years between 1887 and 93, but the on periods when he worked for them add up to only about 18 months. I found the payroll records for Kentucky River Mills filed in a box up here at the Kentucky State Library, and those payroll records show when he was getting paid and when he was not. There's more blanks than there are plays. When his name is not among those getting paid. In fact, the unemployed periods, according to those payroll records, add up to more than 4 of the 6 years. Other sources place him in Frankfort many times during those 6 years, not working, doing art. Paul continued living in the family home on Broadway, and numerous sources mention his firm belief that an artist should be able to live on his art. And taking a job would be admitting his failure as an artist. He took this view, he believed it, he felt very strong about it, and it will come up again. This attitude only got stronger as the years passed, even though he continually struggled to make ends meet. Paul's second art training was in 1889 at the New York Art Students League. League records imply that he was there for 2 semesters, but the 1890 mill payroll records show that he was selling string in Minnesota, from there to Delaware in April. Therefore, he wasn't in school. Around this time, Paul and Mamie Bull's names became linked romantically. If you look at older biographies of Paul Sawyier, they say things like, while attending a party at Emma Morris's home, Paul met and fell in love with Miss Mamie Bull. The fact is, Frankfort was a small town in those days. Everybody knew everybody else. The Bulls lived only 7 or 8 blocks from where the Sawyer's house was, and Mamie had 5 brothers that Paul certainly would have known. One brother even appeared in a stage play with Paul. In 1871, the new 2nd Street School was Frankfort's only public school, and Paul, when he turned 6 years old in March and enrolled in 1st grade, that's September, Mamie reached age 6 in that July. Now, I lack proof that she entered school the same time as Paul, but the Bull family lived just 2 blocks from the school in South Frankfort. And a photo a few years later shows Mamie's sister Cordelia standing in a group of kids at the school's front door. So the Bull family did attend 2nd Street School. I conclude that Paul and Mamie probably knew each other all their lives, even though earlier biographies say otherwise. Those earlier biographies didn't have the benefit of all the sources I had when I wrote a biography. I was able to turn out several new things. In any case, I mention this romantic relationship, however it came to pass, because the 2 people's stories are linked. Mamie Bull's story is called Sawyer's story, and his story most emphatically is Mamie's story, and neither is complete without the other. So you'll hear more about this as I speak. Aside from all that, Paul and Mamie truly found each other in 1887, when they were both 22 years old. They soon became thick as thieves. They attended many dance events in Frankfort, Midway, and Versailles. One news item called them the handsomest young couple in Frankfort. They frequently went canoeing. Mamie would bring a picnic basket, and Paul would sketch and paint. In spring of 1887, they voted downriver for a week-long group camping trip to Drennan Springs in Henry County. They lived in tents. There was a group of 20 or more of them. Lived in tents, ate at a campfire, spent their days playing games and dancing, and when they returned, Mamie wrote a poem. The poem begins, yes, tonight my lips have spoken, words I said they should not speak, and I would I could recall them, would I had not been so weak. And after 3 verses, the poem ends, but I meant to keep one secret in my bosom always hid, for I never meant to tell you that I loved you, but I did. I made a little booklet of several of Mamie's poems. She was a good poet. She was very good. And she wrote a lot of poems, which you can find a lot of today at a library at the University of Louisville. I copied 6 of her poems and put them in this little booklet. And there's a bunch of these back there on that table. Everyone here is invited to pick up your own copy and take it away if you would like to see Mamie Bull's poetry. In September 1890, Paul registered for a second time at the Cincinnati Arts Academy. This was his third and last ever formal art training. At age 25, his artistry was well developed, but there is a reasonable question about development of his life. He would live with his parents for the next 18 years. Let me move now to his third life period that I call the mature artist. There are three distinct phases during this third period, and I'll take them in turn. The first one lasted 10 years, and things look pretty bright for Paul. I call it life ascending. He entered the last decade of the 19th century with high hopes. He was a mature artist, painting what he wanted to, impressionist landscapes in watercolor. He was painting more, however, and earning less because as he did more watercolors, he was doing less oil portraits that sold better and paid better. Predictably, he was on the mill's payroll again during 1892 and 93. But January 93 was Paul's last final ever employment at the mill. That he was probably not sorry to see it go can be inferred from the tone of the letters that the mill constantly sent him while he was on the road, like this one he received in Indiana. My dear Paul, we're disappointed that you made only one town Monday. Try to get over the ground. Write us in regard to crop plantings and other matters likely to increase demand for twine. Yours truly, Kentucky River Mills. Here's another he received in Minnesota. My dear Paul, we hope you are now in running order and will get around the country at a more lively rate. We had only one telegram from you in a whole week. We repeat, write and wire us regularly so we can reach you almost every day. Yours truly, Kentucky River Mills. The panic of 1893 didn't help. This nationwide depression, and it was a depression, lasted several years. Sales plummeted in businesses of every kind. Kentucky River Mills saw hard times and had to reduce its workforce. I infer that this prompted Paul's switch to full-time artistry because he could no longer get on at the mill when he ran out of money. He had always worked for the mill only as a last resort anyway, and when poor art sales forced him to take a salaried job. When the mill option closed, he increasingly painted scenes in and around Frankfort, including a lot of the ones that you're most familiar with. In 1893, Frankfort was under pressure from the federal government to replace its old covered bridge on St. Clair Street. That bridge was the only access coming from the south to the new federal building, which has just been built at the corner of St. Clair and Wapping Street. It's the same building, that beautiful old building you see there today, sitting there vacant and unused. Citizen reluctance to tear down the beloved old covered bridge, which had been built in 1847, had delayed action for years. The city finally agreed to build a new bridge on condition that the old one would remain in place till the new one was completed. However, in August, the entire south end of the old bridge, the covered bridge, collapsed and went into the river. And so it was closed forever, and work speeded up on the new span, which was be known as the Steel Bridge because it was made of steel instead of covered wood. Until 1937, when the new bridge's worn-out wooden floor was replaced with steel grates, and people started calling it the Singing Bridge. Before the covered bridge got fully torn down, Paul finished etching 2 copper plates of the old bridge that he had started years earlier. And when you get time, if you walk across the hall, straight on that wall, straight there, I'm looking at it, hangs his copper etching of the covered bridge. As it happened, Joe LeCount ran a drugstore here in Frankfort, and it sold art supplies, for which Paul had a running charge account. His charge account lasted many, many years and never got paid off. Joe and Paul struck a deal. Joe would pay to send Paul's copper etchings to a Chicago printer who would produce paper prints. Joe would then sell these prints for $6 or $7, give half of the profit to Paul, and use his half to reduce Paul's never-ending bill. The prints turned out to be popular, and sales were good. History does not record whether it was Paul or Joe LeCount who thought up this deal, but my money's on Joe. Later that year, Paul traded some paintings for cash so he could afford to attend the Chicago World Columbian Exposition, World's Fair of 1893. He took some paintings to show in Kentucky's exhibit there at the fair. Around this time, he also did an impressionist waterscape of himself and Mamie in a canoe, her fingers trailing in the water. It's one of the more popular Sawyer paintings. Mamie's scrapbook of the same period contains a long list of their friends who had gotten married. For example, March 1890, Sue French to Logan McKee. June 1893, Suzanne Smith to Western Thomas. These things clearly were on her mind. Paul's paintings were sold through various stores in Frankfort, and Frank Stagg's hardware store might seem to us a kind of an odd place to sell art, but Frank was Paul's buddy, and people did buy some of their art at the hardware store. But acclaim for his art was not widespread, and sales never really took off. There's no evidence that Paul ever did well at marketing his work or at selling, period. Witness how he disliked traveling as a rope and twine salesman. 2 years into the Depression, Paul's father, Nathaniel Sawyer Jr., Nat Sawyer, borrowed $5,500 from Farmers Bank. The Depression was on, the mill was in trouble, and what he borrowed in those days was an absolutely enormous sum. $5,500 was a lot of money. Payoff was due in 6 months, but what happened was a series of defaults, lawsuits, and court actions. These dragged on over 6 years, and they were absolutely disastrous for Nat, his wife Ellen, and their son Paul. Making matters worse, Nat was, unknown to most, at this time he was developing dementia, and he would soon be unable to earn a living. There's a great deal more to this story about his loan and another loan at a bank that knew better. The other bank made a loan when they knew good and well that he was getting dementia. It's a long story. It's available in the book. It's a very interesting story. It's much too long to cover here, so I'll move on. Paul spent many happy hours idling in the Turf Cafe on St. Clair Street. Known as Jimmy Gibbons' place, the Turf Cafe was no ordinary place. It had a back room where the good old boys hung out. These included state senators, judges, the governor, other high state officials, and Paul Sawyer. They ate, gossiped, smoked, and drank in grand privacy because the tap room's entrance was through a side door straight off the street, so they wouldn't have to be seen going through the dining room. Paul's friends remembered him as ambivalent about concentrated work. It is said that he could not sit down and paint just on demand, and he skipped painting for days at a time. One friend said, Paul would idle around Frankfort for several months until necessity urged him, when he would suddenly become industrious and go frequently into the field and paint many pictures. There he is on plein air. He would go weeks painting nothing at all. Some people thought him simply lazy. He loved joining friends on a houseboat and go up the river for 2 weeks of fishing and camping. Some of his buddies on these trips said Paul didn't do too much of the cooking or camp work. Tom Averill said Paul Sawyier was hardly ever painting then. He was usually playing the guitar or just lounging around playing cards. His paintings in this period included many views of the covered ridges at Schweitzer and Forks of Elkhorn. As for his romance with Mamie Bull, the years were simply rolling by. In this third period of life, the second phase lasted 8 years, 1899 to 1907, and I call it life descending. On January 30th, 1900, Governor-to-be William Goebel was shot down, assassinated 2 blocks from the Sawyer home on the old Capitol grounds. Nat Sawyer's worsening dementia and the family's financial distress were becoming widespread public knowledge. The First Baptist Church, in an act of mercy, invited the Sawyers to come live in the parsonage that had been built with money donated by Ellen's mother. This was a grand thing because the Sawyers then could rent out their own home. It was a large 2-story house with many rooms. They could rent out the rooms and have a small but dependable income to live on. So that's what they did. Paul's sisters had married, all 3 had married and moved far away to the northeast, and his brother had died in Mississippi. So these times were especially hard on Ellen Sawyer, who had never in her life known financial hardship. Paul was responsibly helpful during these difficult years, though he also was often out and away in a canoe for days at a time. Around 1900, Paul painted a series of views in and around Frankfort Cemetery as a gift for Mamie. She loved poetry, and Paul's paintings were based on a poem, The 2 Villages, by Rose Terry Cook. It alludes to a village of people at the foot of a hill and another village of the dead in a cemetery on the hill high above. The poem and the paintings seem ironic in retrospect. With Paul and his mother facing hard times, plus the humiliation of legal proceedings for Nat's unpaid loans, Ellen tried to supplement their income by baking pastries and cakes. This ended when she got up one night in the dark to see why Nat was moaning, fell over a chair and broke her hip. By 1907, her health was in serious decline. Nat was mostly bedridden, and the cost of caretakers was a major drain on their tight budget. Friends often bought Paul's paintings just to help keep food on their table. It seems remarkable that Paul was able to get out and paint at all at a time like this, but many of his best-known subjects from this first decade of the 20th century are street scenes, waterways, and countryside in and around Frankfort. Paul Sawyer was known as a neat person. Someone who knew him well said, quote, Paul would go out on Elkhorn for a month, and when he returned, he was just as good of appearance as when he left. Never got dirty on his outing trips. Never saw him looking untidy in appearance. This photo, taken in his studio, shows him in a white shirt with no trace of paint splatters on it. Nat Sawyer's dementia kept getting worse, but he could still get out of bed and wander. And this was a concern because the riverbank beside the parsonage fell steeply into the water, as it does still today. It was hard to hire people willing to care for his difficult father, and with Ellen unable to help, caregivers were now needed around the clock. Paul's overnight outings declined. Things finally got so bad there was no choice but to commit his father to institutional care. He went first to Lexington and a few months later was moved to Louisville's Lakeland Insane Asylum, known today as Central State Hospital. There he would die 2 years later. Ellen Sawyer then became increasingly despondent and lost interest in living. In February 1908, she made her will, leaving her Broadway home to Paul, with proviso that he should not sell it while his father was still alive. She died just a few weeks later. Realizing that he must now move out of the parsonage, Paul wrote to his sisters to come get anything they wanted, and he had a public sale for the rest. The sale proceeds were described as meager. At age 43, Paul Sawyer had no home and no dependable income. But 2 months later, Paul signed a 1.5-year contract with C.F. Brower, a Lexington retailer who sold high-end home furnishings. It was Paul's first on-the-record business deal to sell his art in a broader market. Brower got exclusive rights to all Kentucky sales of Paul's art and would pay Paul 25% of whatever price he put on each piece that Paul delivered. From Paul's viewpoint, this was a bonanza. To get paid, all he had to do was paint a picture and deliver it. Well, Paul delivered paintings considerably faster than Brower could sell them. For the first time in his life, Paul was actually making a decent living with his art. From Brower's viewpoint, this 1.5-year contract couldn't end soon enough. In many ways, 1908 was truly a major year of transition for Paul Sawyer. In January, Nat entered institutional care. In February, Ellen Sawyer made her will and soon died. June, Paul signed his contract with Brower. In August, he bought a 20-foot houseboat and a motorboat and a pontoon boat and a canoe. He named his fleet Ragtag, Bob, and Tail, and he immediately moved into the houseboat. In late August, Paul left Frankfort forever with his motorboat pulling the other 3 craft up the Kentucky River to its junction with Dix River, where he tied up. On November the 30th, or from November the 30th to December the 5th, he had a major exhibition of his art at Brower's in Lexington. And on December the 25th that year, Paul Sawyer and Mamie Bull, in the 22nd year of their romance, became engaged. But they kept it secret and told no one. And here, 117 years later, no one yet knows why. In the third phase of this productive period of his life, it lasted 5 years, from 1908 to 12, and I call it Life on the River. He had tied his houseboat up on Dix River near its junction with the Kentucky River near High Bridge. He knew the area already from his previous excursions there with his fishing buddies. To understand his story for the next 5 years, you need to know a little bit about this bridge. When High Bridge opened in 1879, it was the highest railroad bridge in the world, 275 feet high and 1,125 feet long. Now, 30 years later, it needed to be strengthened so it could carry safely modern trains that were much heavier than those it had been built to carry. The project was to build a new, larger structure around the old one, and trains would keep running while this work was being done. The project supervisor was Curtis Doherty, chief engineer for Cincinnati Southern Railway. He came down from his home in Cincinnati, and since he was going to be here 2 years, he brought along his wife. Mrs. Doherty, knowing her husband would spend most of his time out on the project, brought along her young companion, a comely 21-year-old lass named Rose Stoddard. And Rose, knowing that Mrs. Doherty would not need her for long hours on many days, came looking for adventures to ensure that she would enjoy herself for 2 long years at High Ridge. Riding with 2 friends in a horse-drawn cart, she came upon Paul Sawyier beside the road painting the Palisades. Rose's diary says that they surrounded Paul's easel and the cart driver made introductions. Paul and Rose became immediate friends, and then better friends. Paul was soon a frequent dinner guest at the Doherty's house. For the next 21 months, Rose and Paul would be seen spending many hours together on many days, some say almost all days, wandering in isolated vistas around the beautiful High Ridge vicinity. She was 21, he was 44. It is recorded that Mrs. Doherty noticed all this, and she approved. Paul sometimes joined the Dohertys and Rose on overnight trains home to Cincinnati. He was with Rose on New Year's Eve, 1910, the end of his Brower contract in Lexington. Brower is said to have been considerably relieved because he was quite overstocked with unsold watercolors of the High Ridge area. Paul's steady income thus ended. A month later, he was again earning less than his living expenses. Now, despite his poverty, Paul enjoyed a fairly constant social life at High Ridge. And if you noticed all those people on that houseboat a moment ago, many tourists found their way to his houseboat, such as socialite and writer Mary Darby Fitzhugh. In a long, flowery article, she gushed, quote, "Hospitality is Paul Sawyer's long suit. Many are the friends who find their way down to the river to be royally entertained by this prince of good fellows." On the morning of June 23rd, 1910, Mamie Bull arrived altogether unexpectedly at Paul's houseboat and stated what was on her mind. In their 23rd year as a couple, 18 months after their engagement, Mamie terminated the engagement. Then she turned and left. Her feelings are well represented in that little poetry booklet right there on the table. Feel free to get a copy. Paul would maintain his houseboat life at High Ridge for 3 more years. He and Rose continued their close daily relationship until the project was completed and the Dohertys moved home. His final years at High Ridge can be described as dismal. His artistic future was unclear. He constantly scraped for enough money to get by. Knowing this, Brower in Lexington generously offered Paul a job in his store. But Paul was only insulted, and he angrily rejected it. In a bizarre incident, he also angrily rejected an offer from President William Howard Taft to exhibit his art in the Corcoran Art Museum in Washington, D.C. Years earlier, the Sawyers and the Tafts had been neighbors in Ohio, and their friendship endured after Taft became president. Taft sent word for Paul to submit some paintings, and he, Taft, would ensure that they were exhibited. Paul didn't reply. So Taft repeated the invitation on White House stationery. Again, Paul ignored it. Years later, Paul's sister would explain it this way. "I delivered my message, and Paul was indignant. Said even if Mr. Taft were president of the USA, who was he to drum up opportunities for him to display his work? That Taft was out of his mind if he thought for a minute that he, Paul, would show his work in an art gallery like the Corcoran, where daubs are the rule." I must say, all these years later, her explanation explains nothing for me. During these final years on the river, Paul created over 500 paintings, and Bill will tell you more about that directly. Always getting by, selling a painting or two to pay for his next meal. The fourth and final period of Paul Sawyer's life, as I define it, was from ages 48 to 52, 5 years between 1913 and 1917, and I call those 5 years impressions of life. In October 1913, Paul Sawyer left everything he had known since childhood and moved to New York. He would never again live in Kentucky. He set about raising as much cash as possible for the move. He borrowed $415 from Dreyer, $500 from a bank, and sold the family home on Broadway. The buyer, L.V. Marshall, gave Paul $500 and took over paying off second mortgages Paul had against the house. Marshall described it as a good deal. To pay off his art supply bill, Joe gave Paul LeCount his copper plate-covered bridge etchings. Finally, he sold off his 4 boats, including all the houseboat contents except his clothes, art supplies, and paintings. He moved to New York, moved in with his widowed sister Lillian in her New York City apartment. With his usual high productivity, he painted scenes in city parks and ships in New York harbors. He soon had exhibits at several galleries and consignments with several art dealers in the city. At Jackson Galleries, his paintings were now retailing at prices from $20 to $100. Paul quickly learned that New Yorkers favored oils and did not care much for watercolors, so he was soon painting again in the oils with which his career had begun. On October 7th, 1914, Paul was at Jackson's gallery when he received a telegram notifying of Mamie Bull's death. Within hours, he was on a train to Frankfort. The funeral was at First Presbyterian Church, burial in Frankfort Cemetery. After the funeral, Paul lingered 2 days in Frankfort visiting friends. He then caught a train to New York. Along the way, he stopped off in Cincinnati, spent the afternoon and supper with Rose, then caught the night train on to New York. Meanwhile, his sister Mary Campbell and her husband had been expecting Paul to arrive at their home in Pittsburgh. When Paul arrived in New York, he immediately wrote Mary Campbell that, quote, he had missed meeting her because a Pullman porter forgot to wake him. We may guess that this deception was to avoid his sister's judgment on visiting one love so soon after burying another. Mamie Bull died at age 49, unmarried, unhappy, childless, and alone. She is remembered in a letter written by Frankfort resident Ada May, quote, she was one of the sweetest souls that ever graced this town. Why, if a saint ever walked these streets, it was M.B. What with taking care of her old mother and other members of her family, she had a lifetime of sacrifice, and faithfully did she live it. I tell you, she was the salt of the earth. And did you know that M.B. was P.S.'s sweetheart? It was a beautiful love story, both lovers being too busy, too poor, and too occupied to marry and live their own lives. I would just add, this concludes the details on, oh yeah, Paul Sawyer had a girlfriend. In New York, earlier that year, Paul had met Marie Meyer, a wealthy, art-loving widow described as a very pretty older woman. Their friendship was said to be instant, and they were soon painting together many hours daily in city parks. Marie told Paul about her even wealthier sister's estate up in the Catskill Mountains and invited him to move to the estate where, she said, he could live rent-free indefinitely. The very next spring, he took her up on it. He had 3 strong motivations to move. The New York City market was limited because so many other good artists had preceded him, and all the best subjects were already painted thoroughly. Second, the Catskills had unlimited scenic landscapes, mostly unpainted. And third was his sister Lillian's incessant carping. Lillian was pretty straight-laced, and she was unrelenting in her surveillance of Paul's bottle. She constantly nagged about alcohol in his room, which didn't go down well because Paul had enjoyed freely having a drink all his life, all his adult life, whenever he wanted. With no attachments to the city and multiple incentives to leave, in June 1915, Paul Sawyier was accompanied by Marie Meyer to her sister's palatial 15-room summer cottage near the village of Highmount to live as a guest indefinitely. He spent a summer in splendid luxury. But then Marie's sister prepared for her usual move to the city for the winter. She always closed the summer cottage over the winter, which meant Paul had to move. Marie fixed that by arranging for him to live in a studio on the back grounds of the estate. The studio was an old Dutch Reformed chapel that had been moved in and modified to be a studio. Its only heat was the fireplace. Its high-peaked roof and high-peaked ceiling were one, meaning there was no way to hold the heat down near the floor. Paul was joined in this frigid building by Edward Wijk, a displaced Belgian artist also brought in by Marie Meyer. Both artists were essentially broke. The winter of 1915-16 was very long and very cold, and the 2 men spent the winter in abject misery. Philip Schaefer, who would soon become Paul's landlord, said, "Those 2 lived in the chapel, subsisting on canned victuals. The place was good enough during warm weather, but when winter arrived, they nearly froze to death." There was a fireplace in the building, but it was only by wearing their overcoats on top of whatever bedclothes they had that they managed to live through the winter. He described that winter as a seemingly endless period of no customers, no sales, helpless exposure, interminable suffering, and stark privation, some very considerable part of which was alleviated time and again by Mrs. Meyer from her private purse. Marie gave Paul warm, long underwear, a sheepskin coat, art supplies, and gifts of cash. The estate's groundskeeper, V.C. Todd, said, "Mrs. Meyer always acted like she was a little bit in love with Paul." Todd also says Paul and Wijk got away from the miserably cold studio as often as they could. Quote, "They took dinner at our house frequently. They would have starved to death if it wasn't for us." The artist thanked the Todds with paintings. That winter was undoubtedly the most dire of Paul's life. His poverty was extreme. There were no winter customers in rural upstate New York, where warm summer brought hordes of tourists. Paul missed Kentucky, and he became depressed. He told Todd his entire life had been a disappointment, and he reminisced often about his happy life on the houseboat. Still, no matter how dire things became, Paul never sought income other than his paintings. He finished paintings in the studio wearing gloves and his new sheepskin coat, and he began binging on alcohol. He traded many excellent paintings for cash to buy whiskey and food. So for the first time in his life, that legend I heard became the truth. He told his sister Lillian, living at Highmount was as near hell as anything on this earth could be. However, letters he sent to his cousin Jeannie that winter told her he was fascinated with this place and letters to his friend Townsend were entirely upbeat. Such inconsistencies, of which there are many, display Paul Sawyier as a much more complex fellow than has been previously described. When spring came, Paul and Vike moved to the nearby village of Fleischmann's and rented rooms from part-time merchant Philip Schaefer, who coincidentally sold art supplies. Paul remained with the Schaefers for the last 3 years of his life. They were soon treating him as a member of the family. He painted through the next summer's tourist season, but when fall arrived, he was broke again. Broke or not, he did manage to afford 2 trips to visit Rose in Cincinnati. Soon after that, he was diagnosed with heart disease. Typically, he told no one. His heavy drinking became frequent and excessive, but he was always very discreet. He was never seen drunk in public, and he always maintained his image as a gentleman. His image and his artistic talent at this point in life were about all he had left. The Schaefers noticed that Paul's health was declining. In the summer of 1917, he fell ill after surgery to remove several badly infected teeth. Then immediately he went camping for several weeks to, quote, get some healthy fresh air. Schaefer reported that Paul and a young neighborhood companion lived in a tent, fished, drank strong coffee, ate too little food, and drank too much spiritus fermenti. From this point on, Paul's health began to go down. On September 5th, he wrote his sister Mary Campbell describing a lucrative new deal with Detroit Printing Company. This involved exhibitions in several Midwestern cities, exhibitions of his art over the coming months. It seems unbearably ironic that at this late hour, Paul's name was finally becoming better known and his art was finally selling at respectable prices, such that the Detroit Printing Company would want him to do this. 8 weeks later, after dinner with the Schaefers, Paul asked to be helped up the stairs and collapsed. A doctor was called, but he could do nothing for Paul's chest pains and labored breathing. Paul suffered in bed several days, then quietly died. Schaefer would subsequently write, "Poor Paul, a good painter who deserved recognition, who did notable work, but died almost penniless." Paul's 3 sisters convened at the Schaefer home, emptied his room, read his collected bundles of letters, and burned them every one. Paintings in his room were auctioned to pay burial expense. 6 years later, his cousin Russell McCreary had Paul's body removed and brought to Frankfort Cemetery, just 100 yards uphill from Daniel Boone, overlooking his beloved river. Paul's old friend Edwin Morrow, the same one who signed the 19th Amendment, ladies, he was now Kentucky's governor, and he gave an eloquent eulogy at the gravesite. My telling of Paul Sawyer's story ends with a recommendation, and I recommend it with the strongest emphasis I know how to deliver. Paul Sawyier called Frankfort that sweet old town. That's a quote. He said that. And it is. Frankfort is a sweet community of neighborhoods. Our well-forested small city also contains probably the most beautiful stretch of urban river in the United States. Our beautiful Kentucky River's big S-curve extends some 2 miles right through the heart of downtown Frankfort, from the east-west connector clear to Lewis Ferry Road. When we finally construct a fully developed nature trail along that entire 2 miles with several wide spots where artists can set up their easels and paint, I recommend it be named the Paul Sawyier Riverwalk. In honor of our most famous son, the artist who lived a normal but interesting life right here in Frankfort and painted for us so many beloved scenes in our sweet old town. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. We're going to take like 5 minutes tops, and we're going to switch out our PowerPoints and get ready for our next speaker, which will be Bill Coffey. Also, just want to give a little plug. After Bill is done, Dr. Dean Birch is here with some copies of the book on behalf of the book that Don Coffey wrote, his Paul Sawyier biography, on behalf of the Capital City Museum, and he will be happy to sell you one if you would like, and then you can have this good gentleman sign it for you. So, it'll be a wonderful gift, wouldn't it? So, all right, we'll be right back together in a second. All right, if everybody will be finding your way back to your seat, we'll go ahead and get started. Over here, so just kind of, or nod at me when you want me to change, okay? All right, thank you all so much for sticking around. For the second part of our evening, we are so honored to be able to introduce our second William Coffey of the evening. This is William H. Bill Coffey, who is a descendant of Lewis Russell Coffey, who settled in Monticello in Wayne County, Kentucky in 1807. While Bill's parents were natives of Kentucky, his father's job meant that the family moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and then St. Louis, Missouri. Bill graduated from the University of Missouri, and after college, he worked for a bookbinding company. In the late 1960s, he was a commissioned U.S. Army officer, and he then sold color copiers for the Xerox Corporation. In 1976, Bill moved to Frankfort and purchased Paul Sawyier Galleries from his brother, Coleman Coffey, one of the company's creators. And if you're interested in more of the history behind Paul Sawyier Galleries, there's a sheet back there on the table that you can learn a little bit more about that. Bill has an adult daughter, Kathy, who lives in Prescott, Arizona, who has, as Bill says, 3 fine, well-educated married sons. In 1989, Bill met and married Becky and the twins, Alicia and Corey. And they have blessed him with Tanner, Caroline, and Callan. Please help me to welcome to the podium now, Bill Coffey.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the library being here, John having the program for us. What I'm going to do is I've got slides and I have art prints, and I'll move through them pretty quickly. After the program, I'll be available if you have questions, but I want to keep my presentation to 30 minutes if I can, so that if you've got other things going on, such as UK, that'd be fine. That's all right. That's tough competition. All right. Well, you've seen this picture of Paul. What I'm going to do is go through his period of his life and show you slides. What I tend to forget is that we actually reproduce, there's 333 reproductions of Sawyer's work. And I keep thinking everybody knows all about them. But this is my 50th year of being around Paul. And it's been quite a journey. And to give you an idea, of what we know, of course, it's from the Gilson book, and his work is in this publication, and you can see the research up at the University of Louisville Art Museum or the library. The other thing was, in 1975, Arthur Jones did, if you really want to know about his art and his life, this is the book that will tell you about that. He wrote his dissertation and was a professor at UK. And most people would not know that about 5 years ago, my age, I thought, well, I better accumulate everything I can on Sawyer. So what I did was I compiled this booklet that's available for research on everything I had ever seen or knew about in terms of images of Paul Sawyer. You can find that here, you can find it at the Historical Society, and you can find it at the Capital City Museum with everything else that I had accumulated on Sawyer information-wise. In terms of Sawyer's productivity, I know that he had a life of ups and downs, did have money, didn't have money, but in a 30-year career, this is someone that created 1,500 original paintings. I think that's just utterly amazing. And what I'll go through is show you is that my research shows that he did over 60 portraits, and that's the way you made your living back then. We also know he did at least a dozen etchings, and we know that from a watercolor standpoint that he created over 1,200 original paintings. So he may not have had money, but he certainly knew how to paint. And somebody once said, well, he was a drunk. Well, if he's a drunk and he could do that, you better start drinking, because he'll be pretty good at it. Go ahead and put, I put this up as an initial slide because, of course, he lived in Ohio, and that's where he was raised on a farm the first 5 years. And ironically, I happened to be up in Ohio, and this lady called me and said, I have found this Sawyer. Is he worth anything? Well, we sold the painting and reproduced it. And I thought it was really just a cute image and a good way to start a demonstration of what his capability was. Go ahead, Diane, and start showing some slides there. By the way, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to go through these and show you these different prints. Now, afterwards, I do have a print that everybody gets, at least one free print. But everything I show here, I'm going to put on these tables and let everybody fight over them if you want one, which will be fine with me. What I'm putting up here are slides to demonstrate to you that he was an outstanding portrait artist. Of course, he was trained by Thomas Noble, William Merritt Chase, and Frank Duveneck. They were among the premier portrait artists of his generation. And most people don't know, other than the rock breaker, they really do not realize that he could do oils or pastels or pencil portrait. He's very, very, very capable. As a matter of fact, in order to go to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, he actually got the Hendricks. He painted 4 portraits for them. That was on this property. And that's the way he got the money to go up there. Now, among his portraits, this one is Governor Scott. It's over at the Kentucky Historical Society. Am I in your way? Okay. What I'm showing you, and of course this one we were able to find, and this was a neighborhood girl that lived next to Judge McCurry, and Sawyer did her work, and it's out there in the lobby. Go ahead.
Behind the checkout desk.
Where do I need to stand?
No, you're fine. The painting is behind the checkout desk.
Behind the checkout desk. Okay, go ahead. And this one I acquired and was able to work a deal with the Capitol Museum, and it's on display over there. What I'm trying to tell you is he did fantastic work, and you can actually see some examples of them. But I've accumulated that there's over 60 of them. That's the other one. The other thing is Don talked about, and of course he did scenes that involved him. This is one we reproduced early on. And then later we found this piece of the hemp brake. And my brother Coleman actually gave the museum a loan of his hemp brake. I think what impressed me so much about getting to know Sawyer is that what he did was actually captured life here in Frankfort. And that's the whole essence of his story. He lived here, he lived on Main Street, and he did imagery all over. We also know he did etchings. And there's a whole series of about 10 of them. This is one of those where they later sold the plates. They were eventually destroyed in a fire. But he loved to do the end of the bridge, the side of the bridge. If you are aware of the tables in the back or the mosaic, this is, of course, Bob Humphreys and his daughter Rebecca is here. They allowed the library to reproduce it. What I love about things like this is that this shows the old covered bridge, and I love to see what were in the buildings. By the same token, later, he would do something like this, would be the same scene, but this has got the singing bridge in it. So as you look through the series of different things, you see that he was very capable of creating imagery. Now, most of them may have been pot bowlers, as they call them, but he loved to do the bridge. This one was, some people don't know, this was one of our more recent reproductions, All of the Fault of Gene Birch, who does a very capable job. This is a pastel that was found in Minneapolis. I think this sold for about $100,000 recently. By the way, over on the table are two originals that I've recently received. They're for sale. I take checks tonight. I've got a whole series just showing that he did different images of the south end of the bridge, like this. And I appreciate that I'm going through these fairly quickly, but I want you to be able to see the range of things that he did. He also did, this is the south end of the bridge. He also did the north end. By the way, this was the print of the year in 1975, and the original of it is actually hanging just outside the door. And that's because they were donated on loan, in effect, from the local bank. And by the way, you may not know it, and I'll tell you later, once he went to New York, he changed his signature. So he went from uppercase to lowercase script. So if you want to know when did he paint it, we know he painted after 1913 when he changed his signature. The other aspect of what I like about Sawyer is, for example, that I showed you the south end of the bridge. This is actually looking the other way down Bridge Street. And that's toward the Hannah House where he went in the last 2 years of high school. He also, of course, did, let's see, other bridges, Schweitzer Covered Bridge. He did Knight's Bridge. Most people don't realize there actually was a bridge over at Devil's Hollow. So there's one like that. And I love the fact that he liked the waterways and included boating and things like that in it. Don mentioned that he also did a series of the two villages, which are all a part of a collection up at the Kentucky Historical Society. This is from Boone's Bluff. This is Blanton's Landing as part of the Humphreys collection. There's no way I can ever thank Rebecca's father for having faith in me as a young person, because when I bought the business, the King family only had 60 paintings. I bought a business and I didn't have anything else to paint or to reproduce. So Bob allowed me to start on his collection, and this is just a magnificent oil. And ironically, this is the barges. And again, this is part of the J.J. King collection. and you can tell from the signature. Most people don't realize that J.J. King was about 20 years younger than Sawyer and only met him in the last few years of his life. And so he was a real benefactor to Sawyer. And so he accumulated about 60 paintings that most of them hung in the Frankfort Hotel. And if you want to know the history of Paul Sawyier galleries and how that started, we can get into that at another time. Another thing I wanted to indicate to you is these little types of things show up where you have a little painting like this of a family going up the hill to the cemetery. How do we know that? Because you can see the cupola of the 2nd Street School in the distance. I think these are just absolutely wonderful pieces of art. Let's see, that's the fountain. Of course, that's Good Shepherd right on the corner. And another area that Sawyer seemed to love to paint was, if you know where that is, right? I want to call it State National Bank. And he did a whole series where they would be like the winter scene like this. And then we have, this is the trolley, Main Street trolley. By the way, the lady that bought this, her father was a judge on the way back from E-Town. They happened to stop in Bardstown by the side of the road. He said, "What do you want out of here, honey?" And that's what you got. We sold it for her, and she said, "Do I give the kids money?" I said, "Heck no, spend it yourself." This is probably one of the most lovely paintings. This is Walking in the Rain. I mean, these are just, they're Kentucky scenes, and they were done in Kentucky. Just absolutely magnificent paintings. And we probably sold most of these in the $20,000, $25,000 range. If I had this painting today, it would be over $50,000. If you've got one in your closet, let me know. And you have no idea how many show up like that. The two I have over there, I didn't even know that the family owned these. They were from the Maine Bull collection. And anyway, it's fun when somebody calls and says, "I can't find the picture of that particular Sawyer." And I say, "Well, I'm so sorry. You have an original painting, and it's only worth this amount of money." Now, Sawyer also loved to do scenes like this of the St. Clair Mall. And, of course, he went to 2nd Street School. And this is at the bottom of the hill. That's what that image is. By the same token, he did Going Up the Hill. So he just shows us all aspects of the way life was back at the late 1800s. This one I really like. This is this is one of the newer images that we created, and Gene just magnificent in his photography and is able to reproduce things. And this is just near the entrance to the cemetery. He also liked to do things, this is showing, of course, right out here, and this is a print that each of you, if you want it, can have it at the end of the night. I've got that for you. And this is a pair that I found up in Indiana, which I like very much. One of the more popular ones that we've had reproduced through the years. The other thing, of course, that Sawyer loved was, man, that guy liked to fish. And we have a variety of scenes like this. This one we call Stedmantown because he wrote on the back that it was Stedmantown. It's kind of like one of the paintings, the original paintings over there has got a name on the back of it, and that's really unusual. He, of course, loved Indian Head Rock. And I don't know how many, probably 50 different images like that. And I know I'm going through this fairly rapidly, but these are up here if you want to look at. And I appreciate your interest tonight in being here. The other thing Sawyer did was to create a lot of images like this. And what people don't realize, they're basically watercolors, but what he did was use gouache. And so he would highlight the water and the rocks so that it would just give it a real special look. Most of what I'm showing you are all scenes that he did create while he lived in Kentucky. And he was just a master, and he would, I'm sure, create a lot of very small pieces and later create large ones. I estimate he probably did about 200 different creek scenes, 200 river scenes, probably 100 road scenes like that. He also, of course, did a number of pieces like this of the arsenal. As a matter of fact, the large arsenal, you may have noticed there's a log cabin right up here on the top. After that was put up there, the lady had come up and looked at what we have. And the way she had positioned it, her main room, if you look right out the room, it's a duplicate of the Sawyer painting. I thought that was really wonderful. Of course, Maine Bull this was a painting that recently sold up in an auction, and most of you are familiar. Whoops, I got ahead of myself. Go ahead and go to the next one. Back it up to that one. Sounds like calls I get from DirecTV and somebody else. I wanted to put this up because I thought it was the most fascinating paintings I've ever found. I wasn't able to reproduce it. It's a pastel, and that is, of course, the Devil's Hollow Bridge, and up in the corner you can see the cupola of 2nd Street School. I think I don't know how good a painting it is, but from a character standpoint, I just think it's just fantastic. And I tried to bring a few slides of things you may not have seen or aware of, so you know that he did some other things. Okay. Now, let's see. This is, of course, Mame, the love of his life. And there really are not very many of his works. Don mentioned the canoe scene, and we did that. What's the next slide? Go ahead, Diane. What do we got next? And do I need to get out of the way? This, of course, is Paul's Love, and this was in the collection. What's interesting about this that most people don't know, it shows the details of her face. In my understanding of art, I'm not an artist or an art critic or anything like that, is that in most of his paintings, of course, he did not include any details. And my understanding is that's so that you could picture what did that person look like. This is one of the few exceptions of showing Mame. Another exception is this oil. I actually found this piece over in South Carolina years ago. And of course it shows a really interesting young man. It eventually ended up in the University of Kentucky Art Museum. And the next slide actually shows where he was a photographer of his art, and that's the duplication of it. The other thing is that I brought a number of these, such as this. If you I assume you've seen all of his work, and you probably have not. But this is 3 kids. There's about 3 different scenes like this. Ironically, when I bought the business, this fellow showed up in he was about my age, showed up in his Porsche with his wife, said, "I'm one of the boys in there." Oh, man, that was thrilling. But we've also done a number of works, like this. And so, you know, I love it when somebody says, I have 3 children, or I have a son, or someone, and I want something that I can frame up for them special like that. The other thing Sawyer loved to do were scenes out at peak. Well, he did the scenes like this of the Orlando Brown House. He also loved to do scenes of Peake's Mill. And I don't know if he just loved going out there and fishing behind it, but you can still go out and see the back of that building and where Canoe, Kentucky is, like that. Now, I threw this slide in. It's actually from New York. Most people don't realize that when Sawyer died, one of his benefactors was Judge McCurry, his cousin. Judge McCurry, when he died, he was a widower, and he left his house in that entire block, like where Pickpack is and all of that, so they could build a new hospital there. And in that apartment complex, they have all of these original Sawyers, and that's one of them. When I first went over there, probably 20 years ago, they were just hanging loose. You could go in and lift them off the wall. I said, you ought to do something about that. The other thing that Sawyer did was he did a lot of road scenes, like this is the road to Midway. You know, they're just interesting little scenes. He also liked to do things like, this one is, of course, the Old Lowington Road, and that's in several sizes that it's available. Probably one of the more famous ones that he did that everybody loved was Springtime. And he did it with and without flowers, but just really pretty. The other thing people don't know is he did scenes like this that were wooded. See, I keep thinking you guys know all this stuff and have seen them, but if you haven't, he did some fascinating works. He also, of course, loved to do Big Eddie. This is an oil that's over at the Historical Society. Unfortunately, there's only 3 Sawyers on display over there, a portrait, an oil, and a watercolor. They have 125 back in their storage. That's really a shame. This is another scene of down at Big Eddie. Yeah. I also appreciate that Sawyer did scenes like of the old Capitol like this. And we also, is the next one showing the new Capitol. Someone here, I'm not going to identify them, they own one of these, and there's 2 different versions of this, plus this one. So we do know that he did at least 3 images that include the new Capitol dome. Where are we going from here? All right, let's see. Whoops, back up. Recently, we found out that he did one scene of St. Louis. We know that he had paintings in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. That's where he was impressed by the Chicago, in other words, the French Impressionism. We also know he had work in the St. Louis World's Fair in 1903. Unfortunately, we don't know what's listed and we don't know what the images were, but we do know he had work there. And go ahead, Diane. And I put this up because most people, this family happened to be at a garage sale and they found this fan. I hope one day they'll donate it for somebody to have it on display. I put these up because Sawyer also did a lot of our churches. And this, of course, is showing the First Methodist Church. I had a lady that told me one time she knew that little road there, and they would, in the wintertime, slide down that road into the Kentucky River when it was frozen over. I thought that took courage. Let's see, what else have we got? Maine Bull and their family went to the First Presbyterian Church, and that's over on the left. This is also the only oval painting that we have ever found by Sawyier. And that's Main Street, 1900. It's really kind of hard to tell, but you may not realize there's a lady with a parasol in it, and there's a carriage down there, and there's the carriage stepping stone. He included a lot of things from his era. Of course, he also liked to do this scene a lot, and included the library, usually the old post office, Good Shepherd, and the First Baptist Church. I thought this was just a wonderful find. This is the only painting that we know of that actually shows the First Baptist Church, the original church. Of course, his mother, Wingate, she donated the money for the Wingate Chapel. That's what this is called over there. And I interviewed a lady one time that when she was quite young would ride her horse down, and she said, I would stop there and get a drink out of the fountain. The mystery is we don't know whatever happened to the fountain. We don't know. As Don said, after his mother died in 1908, he spent 5 years down on the river. And we found this painting that shows his river boats. So we thought that was kind of interesting to find. I forgot to say, I told Diane earlier, her name is Dehoney. This actually was in Mayor Dehoney's collection that we found. I thought, well, we hadn't really done anything of a rural church. There won't be much interest in it. I wish we'd done 3 times as many prints. Very popular. Okay, and that's, of course, the old library, courthouse, and Good Shepherd. And he did it from every possible angle, I think, on boat. And a lot of times you'll find it either like the Singing Bridge showing or the old covered bridge. And you've seen this one. He loved to do that fountain. Oh, and I put this up because people don't know. This is the Episcopal Church. I sure wish we had been able to reproduce it. So I want to make sure you knew that there actually was a scene of it. What else is that? Oh, and this came up last year. This is a scene, this actually is owned by a couple in England. And most people don't realize the Kentucky River would freeze over. And this shows the minister of the Christian church and his wife and Ann Thomas, that was a friend of Maine Bull. So nobody has seen those 2 images before unless something unusual. What Sawyier did, of course, after his mother died, he spent 5 years on the Kentucky River. And of course what he did was did scenes like this of the Palisades, and he did a lot of versions of it, like I call this one Warm Reflections. And then we've got, let's see, Gene just did this for us recently. I thought that was really neat. This guy is a master. Everybody look at Gene, make him blush. Go ahead to the next one. This is one of the most popular things we've ever done. It's an oil of the church at Troy. And it's on the way down to High Bridge. The church is still there, by the way. This is, of course, the High Bridge. Now, by the same token, this is a Kentucky scene. And this is High Bridge when he lived in New York. Can you tell the difference? Much looser, much more light, much difference in his technique. I don't think it was just alcohol. I think he just developed a different technique. Now, when he lived down in High Bridge, if you've ever been down there, there's a village down below. So he loved doing scenes on the river from various scenes like this down below. And this is the same scene, and later I'll show you a rainy day on Lexington. You might notice a little dot of red, and there's a little girl in these paintings, and she's got a red hat on, and she shows up in a number of his paintings. What's next, Diane? Oh, okay. There's a little girl. You can't tell, but she's got the red hat on. And so let's see, I can skip here. This is the first oil we reproduced. And she's got a little red hat on there. It's kind of hard to tell, but we didn't reproduce oils for a long time because there was not a technology that really allowed us to do it. But this was my 100th reproduction. I started at number 50 and ended at 231, I think. Other groups had reproduced about 100 other Sawyers, but it's been quite a ride over 50 years. There she is in the red hat. Go ahead, Diane. What's the next slide? Well, before I get to that, let me show this. Don showed you a slide, the confluence of the Kentucky River and the Dix River, and that's really what this is. He did a lot of different scenes. There's even 2 scenes right around the corner, original watercolors, that shows the ferry. And of course, this is Camp Nelson, and these are 2 scenes. I think this one's fascinating because it's even got the lady down there in a wash tub. Sawyer included things that you just don't see unless you really look at them closely oftentimes. Go ahead, Diane. That's another one of his few winter scenes. I put this up because people have not seen this. I discovered this over at the library in Transylvania. I even wanted to reproduce it, help them sell it, but they said, no, if you sell it, we don't get the money. I said, that's too bad. But I think it was interesting on showing sheep, and this one is a field scene of the cattle. Just something that you guys have not seen in reproduction or anything like that. This, of course, is the first painting I ever did, a reproduction of Lover's Leap. This was one of the few large scenes that was sent to J.J. King. Just magnificent. Later, we found he did an oil, Lover's Leap 2. This guy he knew what he was doing. People don't realize that along with the 60 portraits, in the last 5 years of his life, he did 200 oils. Now I don't know whether he drank or how much he drank, but you don't do 200 oils in 5 years of this quality level without being an extremely accomplished artist. What else have we got? All right, that's the Lover's Leap. Go ahead. This is, of course, Professor House. He was commissioned to do some paintings of that. And go ahead and do the next one. And Bob Humphreys, God bless him. And this is the Rayburn. This is it. Boy, this is a magnificent painting. It's in the Rayburn collection. And it's just wonderful. The Historical Society also has had some versions like that. Side views, and it's still down there. Ironically, we found out, we never could find it. Eventually did, and found out the guy lived in it, roomed with my brother at UK. So you never know what you're going to find. All right, go ahead, Diane. I want to move along. Oh, this is one of my favorite. Anything like, well, this is just one of my favorite paintings. Go ahead, Diane. All right, let's see, what else? Oh, I did want to He did travel even further than South Camp Nelson. He went down Sweet Lick Mountain, we call it, down in Irvine, Kentucky. So he was up and down the river, all like that. This is his main signature, uppercase, letters like that. And then this is the signature he used on his New York scenes. Go ahead. He did all of these magnificent oils once he was in New York. When he lived with his sister, he concentrated on scenes like this, of the park scenes. There's not many on display, unfortunately. He did a few watercolors like this. This happened to be from Dr. Martin's collection over at Eastern University.
Is this displayed somewhere that you can see it?
Unfortunately, they're not. They're not on display.
Please gather your materials and make your way to a checkout station.
Holy cow. No,
The library will be closing in 10 minutes.
I will hurry. I will hurry. Get these people out of here. Go ahead, Ty. No, unfortunately, they're not on display. I don't have an answer for you. Go ahead, and what's the next slide? After living with his sister for about a year and a half, seeking new markets, he did move to the Catskills. Initially, he lived at High Mount. It was nice for a while. Go ahead to the next slide. This was the Emory estate. And when he first came, he lived in this carriage house. I've been there a couple of times. But boy, when he lived in that church chapel, it was a stone building and no heat. It had to be miserable. So what happened was he eventually moved over to Flashman's, which is much like a little town like Frankfort. It's got a little river through it. And he lived with a really nice family. And he did a lot of local scenes like this that he returned either to Mr. King or they were over there at the King's Daughters. This is the firehouse. It's still there. This one is on display at the King's Daughters. It was in the Judge McCurry collection. And again, you can tell from the signature, if you look at it, when he would have painted it. Go ahead, Diane. I don't know what's. Now, I put this up for two reasons. One, it's like, Lord, he looks old like me from being out there, I guess, in wintertime. But ironically, we don't know what happened to the painting. There are so many Sawyers. Ever since I wrote this catalog that I did, I found 50 more paintings. They just kind of show up. I don't know how. Go ahead, Diane. These are a couple of examples of that wonderful little community of Flashmans. This is a winter scene. This one is one of my favorites. And this is, well, you can see the signature. It's New York. Oh, boy, is that a wonderful painting. It's almost breathtaking, and I'm sorry it's not on display. Go ahead, Diane. This one I just showed you. You can see it's New York. Another one like that. This one we discovered. This was actually from up in New York. A guy called me. He was cleaning out on an estate up there and said, "What do I do with this thing?" "Let me know. We'll find a buyer." Actually, this was commissioned by a very wealthy individual up there. And his girlfriend, well, what happened was the guy cleaned it out. His girlfriend didn't like it and said, "Let's sell it." Okay, we'll take care of that. The most famous painting that came back to this for J.J. King is, of course, A Rainy Day in Frankfort. And I did want to tell you, we also found another version like this. What I've tried to do, through the years is just, first of all, it was to make a living, but the other is to how do we find things that are interesting that we think people enjoy. Sometimes the quality was as good as we wanted, sometimes it wasn't. And the last slide this is a house in which he lived and died in Flashman's. And the last slide, this is of the family. I interviewed the sisters when they were alive, 2 sisters and a son. And this is the last slide, isn't this wonderful? The children, little cannon on the back, watchful waiting. This was the last reproduction I did about 5 years ago. There's a lot of others I would like to have done, but the market has changed, so we don't have that anymore. But anyway, that's a very quick run through of what Sawyer did through the years. Now what I'm going to do is I have the free print for you. You can look at the originals. There's some history information on the back. Don's back there to sell the book. I'm going to spread these out. I'm going to run for my life. You can come up and feel free if you want to take one painting, one of the prints. I'm okay with that. And I appreciate very much you showing up. Thank you.